As Steve said, we move now to the Arthur Morgan Award presentation with Ben London and Michael Caselli. Michael, who's going to serve as the MC for this part of the event, is from the class of 1987. He earned his master's in fine arts and sculpture, has worked as a set designer, video designer, technical director, production manager, and occasionally as a performer in work that pushed up against and in many cases disrupted the traditional ideas of what performance, dance, and visual art could be. Michael is now assistant professor of sculpture and installation in his tenure review year, the chair of the arts department at Antioch College, the faculty rep to the board of trustees, and an active member of the alumni board. It is Michael's heartfelt pleasure to be participating in this year's virtual reunion. Welcome, Michael, and take it away.
Thank you, April. Yeah, I'm just really excited and happy to be doing this. Ben and I hadn't really seen each other for a very long time, and it was a chance to reconnect. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into our conversation. So I just wanted to talk about the Arthur Morgan Award and also read from Ben's bio. So the Arthur Morgan Award recognizes contributions by alumni or friends of the college, which exemplify the concept of community advocated by Arthur Morgan. The nominees for this award should be persons or groups of persons who have contributed to their community, either local, national, or world, in a manner which brings members of the community together in order to work toward a common goal. So, Ben London, class of 1989, the 2020 Arthur Morgan awardee. Ben London is a Seattle-based musician, recording artist who currently serves as executive director for Black Fret Seattle, a 501c3 nonprofit that empowers musicians to create and perform new music. Prior, he held senior positions with the Music Museum Experience Music Project, MoPop, the Recording Academy, the Grammys, Hewlett-Packard, and Northwest Polite Society. London was the inaugural chair of the Seattle Music Commission and has served on boards including KEXP and the Vera Project. His music has been featured in a wide variety of movies and television programs. London's music projects include Alcohol Funny Car, St. Bushmills Choir, Sanford Arms, Celine Vigil, and Stag. Ben grew up in a house of music and followed in the footsteps of his mother, Janet McLeod London, class of 56. His parents had met at Antioch. His father was the music director for the Shakespeare Festival, and Ben met his partner, Roseanne Moss London, on campus, continuing the tradition. On arrival at Antioch in 1985, fate, or the magic wand of Doris Eamon, paired Ben with Steve Moriarty as freshman roommates, with Matt Dresner and Adrian Garver in the room next door. It took about 5 minutes for music to break out. Over the next 4 years, they formed bands on campus and co-ops. The college provided the freedom and spaces to play music, record DIY cassettes, and put on shows. It was as if, under the watchful eye of Steve Schwerner, the lunatics had taken over the asylum. After graduation, a group relocated in Seattle in 1989 and pursued careers in music throughout the 90s, realizing the dreams they had imagined as students. The tragic loss of our dear friend and classmate Mia Zapata in 1993 was a major blow to the group, one that they are still reconciling to this day. Over 30 years later, Ben is still working in music. Looking back, he attributes much of his success to Antioch. The college was a unique incubator for critical thinking, creativity, and ingenuity. Ben feels he learned as much from his peers as he did from his professors, and is grateful to this day for the bonds formed in that community. I want to welcome Ben London.
Hey, Michael, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Good, how are you?
Great. It's going to be really hard to follow Keith. That was very, very impressive. I'll say quickly that I want to echo what Keith said, and that I'm very thankful and very honored to be receiving this award today. But feel like many of the people that are on this call, or many of our peers and alumni, could equally be considered for this in terms of the work they've done. I'm so proud to be associated with such an amazing group of people that to call them friends and classmates.
Yeah, I was really moved listening to Stephen and Keith talk because I recognized everything they talk about, right? Those connections, the importance of the people that we were in community with when we were on campus, and how that community has extended to this day. I mean, my closest friends are the people I went to Antioch with. They're people I've worked with, they're people I celebrate with, and the people I grieve with also. So I was really interested in, because of your last part of your bio, talking about the effect of the college had because of the freedom that we had, right? And connecting that to kind of what Keith was talking about, we were able to be leaders. We didn't want to be leaders. We did things that we thought we needed to do. And I'm really interested in your reflections on your time at the college and then leaving and going to Seattle, and how you actually brought that with you because the group of people you left with.
Sure. I and sometimes jokingly say, I guess we're still on co-op, right? We had a big group of us that came out here and are doing this stuff. But being a second generation Antiochian, I kind of grew up with some ideas about what the college was prior to attending. And when I got there, more fully realized some of the things that my mother addressed. Now, I think very much so that the college was much a different place in 1985 when I arrived versus 1956 when my mother graduated. I mean, I think that structurally the college had gone through some challenges, and because of that had become even more sort of freeform in its ability of what the offering was, but also the freedom that it allowed us as students to sort of innovate or iterate again as we saw fit. And so the fact that you don't need much to really start coming up with ideas and executing against them, and you just need some people that believe in the same thing and some spaces to do them in. And really those two things, the fact that there was like-minded people on campus and that we had some spaces to get together and kind of figure these ideas out and try to execute against them, has stayed with me forever. That thought that culture is very interesting, and that what seems on the most fringes of culture over a 20-year march becomes mainstream culture. But if you look at all of these major movements, particularly in the music space, it was a small group of dedicated individuals that had an idea and were just doing what they wanted to do, not because they were trying to imitate or do something else. And that ends up being incredibly influential. And I would say that's probably the case in most industries. If you're just trying to follow what's already happened, you're sort of doomed to failure, because by the time you get there, the rest of the world's moved on to the next thing. And so I feel very lucky that we had that freedom to do that, and some great mentors along the way to inject new ideas and new stimulus into that helped us grow as people as well.
Yeah, so looking at kind of your experience, you've got, I can't read the list because it's pretty extensive, but it's really interesting to see the different things that you've been involved in.
Like I said, co-op for life, right?
Exactly. I feel like I'm on my 58th quarter because I'm now teaching at the college. So I had a longest co-op in the world. But it was something that's really nice when we first reconnected. We talked about how easy it was to fall back into a conversation, that it was just like it hadn't been the 30 years. You're referencing again to what Keith was talking. That 30 years just didn't seem like it created any barriers or any way of impeding our communicating, which are talking to each other and really talking about our lives together, which I find true across the board with, again, the people I went to school with. I'm really interested in your work and its relationship, something we talked about, to advocacy, because when you first look at it, the Grammys, you don't immediately assume that that's related necessarily to advocacy. And so people have a external kind of perception of what these different things are. And I'm really interested in kind of the more internal things that you can talk about how these different things that you've done have affected you and allowed you to advocate.
Sure. Well, for the Grammys, for example, the Recording Academy. So when I first started working there, a lot of people said, "Well, what do you do the other 364 days of the year?" When everybody knows the TV show that happens one night a week. But the way the Recording Academy is, or a lot of things involved, so it's a membership-based organization. There's people, but it's really sort of like an advocacy group. And one of the things that I was most proud of, and what drew me to this more than anything, is there's a subset through the Recording Academy Foundation has a program called Music Cares that we would raise money for through a variety of ways, but gives grants to musicians in crisis situations of all sorts, whether it's rent relief, medical, dental, has put a number of people into rehab or any of these sorts of things. And that people that are drawn to music, the arts, things of this nature, there isn't the safety net that's built into other professions in the same way. If you're a full-time musician, you don't automatically get health insurance with your job. You're independent contractors. We were gig workers before the whole concept of gig worker became mainstreamed. And so I'd say, you mentioned, or in the bio about Mia Zapata, our classmate, getting murdered. And, one of the things that we can trace a lot of the advocacy work that happened in Seattle was tied to Mia's murder and the organizing that we did around trying to find the perpetrator of that. And that took more than just waiting for the police to solve that. And there was a lot of organizing, a lot of fundraising. Valerie Agnew, our classmate, and some friends started a women's self-defense organization called Home Alive, because again, she was like, and many of them were like, we're not going to wait for other people to protect us. We're going to protect ourselves. And that planted a seed along with just sort of the general culture that was tied around the music at that time, that was sort of a DIY, do-it-yourself sort of ideal. And that moved on. And so when we had that organization, that at some point when there was some political things that were bad in the city of Seattle, they had a thing called the Teen Dance Ordinance, where they didn't want people under 18 viewing music with people over 21. Getting that struck down. At one point they tried to introduce a poster ban, which is like one of the main ways that artists market themselves when they don't have any money. And some of the elected leaders thought that it was ugly seeing posters on poles, and getting that overturned. And that just led from one thing to the other until we were able to get to the critical mass to get the city of Seattle to create to add music to their Office of Film, so that we actually had an advocating body that could speak and basically have a seat at the table. You want to have arts and music to be at the seat at any table if you're talking about major development, urban planning, any of these sorts of things. And it took a while to get there, but our city went from trying to try to regulate music and try to push it out as a nuisance to realizing that it was one of the primary drivers for our economy. There was a reason that all these educated high-tech workers wanted to come to Seattle. It wasn't just the jobs, it was the nightlife and the interesting things they could do. And similarly for tourism and all these sorts of things, right? There was a point where between, quote unquote grunge and having Ichiro on the Seattle Mariners, we were the #1 youth destination for Asian youth to travel in the world for a couple of years, just because they wanted to come make the pilgrimage to Seattle. So it's finding ways to capture the power of these different movements that start very small, but then try to use them for good once you're in a position to leverage that power to move things forward.
So it's interesting to hear you talk about the pushback, the poster ban, the dance ban, and thinking about the Experience Music Project, which you started working at in 1996. So it seems like there's a tension, right, between kind of the impression of Seattle, especially with regards to music, and the reaction of Seattle with regards to music. So I'm wondering if the Experience Music Project prepared you to kind of also move in this realm.
Well, it did. I think that, as being somebody that grew up and was, music was my thing pretty much my whole life, finding a place where I could use those skills along with the other skills that I had gathered from the time of being a professional musician, from the time I left Antioch until about that point. It was an interesting project. And, there was one thing I like about Seattle is there's a healthy level of skepticism about everything often. And so there was, when this was being built, because it was being financed by Paul Allen, who's one of the people that started Microsoft, him and Bill Gates started it together. There was a lot of skepticism about what it was going to be. But ultimately, to me, I feel that anytime people with money and power are giving back and supporting the arts, that's a good thing, because they're cultivating the ideas that are going to change everything. And so working on that was great, but also understanding that preserving history is very important, and legitimizing the work that's going on. And so that, again, when you talk about people that were the founders of what became this worldwide phenomenon, that were doing this in the mid 80s, around the time I was at Antioch, people were getting the things going here and playing in these tiny little rooms and doing that stuff, and then getting vilified by the mayor and city council and all that sort of stuff, and then they're giving them the key to the city 10 years later. So it's not everybody. People need context, right, to understand why this stuff is important. And that's why historians do the work they do, and that's why museums exist, and all of that. And so I was glad to be a conduit to help sort of be one of the people that helped distill that down, and then also create a platform for celebration and exploration of a lot of other areas as well, beyond just the navel gazing of celebrating Seattle by itself.
So I'd like to then kind of move to the Seattle Music Commission, because this seems like it's much more directly addressing those issues that you were talking about. And I'm wondering what your work was like, and really kind of how you navigated kind of these conflicts and these tensions.
Sure. Well, I think that by the time the commission came together, there was more of an understanding that this is important. Richard Florida wrote a book on the creative class where he really identified music, and a lot of folks in government saw that as a roadmap and were more open to these ideas. By the time the Music Commission formed, we were thinking more of the music industry as its economic role in our city. And so some of the work we did was went out and got a major economic impact study done on music. And then at a certain point, when that information came back, we were able to say that music was as big an industry as the maritime industry, which is a big industry in Seattle. And that all of a sudden gives you a seat at the table in a different way as well, where all of a sudden it's not just a bunch of disparate people where they think, oh, it's those people that are up late at night making, those deadbeats making music. All of a sudden it's like, oh no, that's an industry and that's big. And in addition to the soft currency that it brings to the city, there's the hard economic impact that has, that the amount of jobs it's creating, the amount of money that it's shedding off. And then also that sort of pivot point where Amazon was coming into dominance at that point, becoming a major force in terms of obviously books, but was pivoting to music and was becoming larger in that way as well. So all of a sudden, and then a new generation of elected leaders coming in as well that were more savvy or more better understanding that. So it was about how do you take that information and try to be an advocate and continue to create an environment that's supportive of our music community. And this work has gone on. I mean, one of the challenges we faced pre-COVID, and this is going to be maybe the catastrophic event that kills many music scenes in cities, is our city was gentrifying at such an extreme rate that many of our creatives could not afford to live here anymore. And so what happens to these major metropolitan areas? It's happening in Austin, it's happening in a lot of places where musicians can no longer afford to live in the city themselves. And the danger in this is that it's happened to the Bay Area very much so, is that they turn into music deserts, right? The clubs get, the real estate's more valuable to build condos and living spaces and all these things, and that people can no longer afford to live there. And then the reason that people move to these vibrant urban hubs are the vibrancy goes away, and so you have your high-paying job but nothing to do.
Yeah, thinking about COVID specifically, I mean, I have a lot of friends who are creatives who are in industries, and everyone's unemployed. You look at things like South by Southwest being canceled. You have these music festivals being canceled. Mm-hmm. These are, when you're talking about kind of the gig economy, it's been decimated by COVID.
Oh, without a doubt. We were the first to close, last to open.
Right.
Is basically what they're saying.
So I'm interested in how you think people can be supported and really survive this, because it's an amazing impact. I mean, I talked to alumni, people like Linda White in New York, who is working on Broadway as a props person, hasn't worked and can't work. So there's all this ways of supporting oneself has been removed. And so how do we move through this in a way that we can support these incredibly important kind of cultural producers? It seems to be even more devalued now because of the current situation we're in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the challenge is, I used the analogy recently that, there's a lot of energy around trying to save the airline industry right now, right? And, people say that, with musicians, they're like, oh, they'll be fine. They'll always find some place to play. And I kind of say, well, that's like saying to the airlines, well, airlines will be fine. They'll always find some place to land if all the airports close. And, so what we're doing a lot of work on right now is trying to preserve particularly the independent music venues around the country, because if they all go away, then how does our music community actually make a living? These are the places where they go to work to do that, right? And similarly, the governmental response on the front end of this, the PPP loans and things of that nature were very hard. The CARES Act were very hard for musicians to access as many gig workers and doing that. And so there's a lot of lobbying nationwide. There's been a lot of coalition building. There's a group called NEVA that's formed that for the first time that's brought 1,000 independent music venues from across the country together in an advocacy posture. And they're actually doing a major event coming up. A couple days of fundraising and advocacy that's going to be featured on the homepage of Google, YouTube. That'll be a bunch of major artists performing at independent venues around the country supporting that. But the real hope right now, and I think there's probably a lot of advocacy on the visual artists side, theater, all of those sorts of things, is depending what happens politically in November, what sort of the next stimulus package, what that'll do to support the arts. Because there's a lot of people that I know personally, that are maybe 15 years younger than me, people that were active musicians that are actively figuring out what's next. That it's just, they're going back to school. They're doing this, that, or the other thing to figure out what their next career is going to be, because they can't support themselves. They can't wait another 18 months to be able to start making money again as a musician.
Yeah, and something else I think about too is kind of the personal nature or the physical nature of the exchange that happens in the arts, in the music, in theater, in dance, and that people are, trying to figure out ways to navigate that. But there's this removal, right? Because we have these screens, right? And
we have these screens too, right? So half the times you see people at concerts and they're looking at this.
Yeah, they could be 10 feet from the stage. And
this is when I know I'm turning into a senior. When I'm turning into a senior citizen, where I'm like, those kids and their phones.
Back when I was your age, I was jumping backwards off that stage.
No, I mean, to me, music is always there's two artifacts in a musical experience, right? There's the sound recording, which you have your own personal experience with, and that's a mobile experience. You can listen to it in your bedroom, you can listen to it in your car, you can listen to it anywhere with headphones blasting through speakers. But then there's the visceral live experience of experiencing music in person. And to me, it's that experience, particularly the place that I find it most vital and enjoyable, is in a room with less than 300 people, where you feel like you're part of this collective community. Granted, going to see, the Rolling Stones in a stadium with 72,000 people, that's a different experience too. But I love that thing of being in a room with 300 people that are all intensely focused, that are all kind of breathing in the rhythm and time with the whole experience. And, we've had to really morph most of the industry to streaming right now, from video streaming. And to me, I support it, and I'm actually producing stuff related to the nonprofit I'm with right now in that space. But that's only a means to an end, in that it's a way to compensate musicians right now. But to me, it's a terrible experience. I don't really, there's a reason MTV existed. If you're going to create a visual form out of that, then you bring filmmakers and artists into it and you interpret the song in a different way. But just simply putting a couple cameras up and shooting a group of people playing music to no audience, it becomes a real kind of sterile experience. So what I love about music is the humanity in it, and I'm missing that right now, and I can't wait for us to get back to that in some form or another, because I think it's good for our souls, it's good for our lives, and I don't know, I could go on for hours about this.
Yeah, something else too. I realize, as a visual artist myself, I'm having really hard time creating. Mm-hmm. The isolation, the lack of direct kind of exchange that happens, and I'm wondering if you're seeing that in people who are doing music, But I also see a lot of kind of new or innovative ways of approaching performance and things. So that makes me hopeful. But I also know there's a definite kind of emotional and kind of psychic impact on people based on the conditions we're under.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we could probably survey everybody that's on this call today, and we're all dealing with this in different ways, right? And some people have found incredible inspiration in this time and are being hyper creative, and that's their way of dealing with it. Some people feel like they have nothing to say. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I mean, I've had conversations with friends where it's like, it's good talking to you, but just to talk to each other and just complain about how bad it is, it just depresses me more, you know. So I'd rather save it up for that time. So I think that's kind of what's happening in music. The bigger challenge, not just from a creation standpoint, is that you had a ton of artists that had well, two things going on. That you had a ton of artists that had stuff in the pipeline that was going to come out that they've had to delay, and when it can actually come out. And then the second part, that the music industry has totally changed over the last 10 years. In my opinion, not necessarily for the best, but you've got a situation where recorded music has been demonetized pretty much, and musicians working musicians, professional musicians, make the majority of their income from playing live. So we all love that we have access to all the music in the world, and if you pay for it, it's $10 a month or whatever. But that's not going to keep the musicians live when they can't go out and play live. And we're talking probably 18 months. I mean, there were people that were rebooking tours for next summer that are now starting to cancel them because they're thinking about it's going to not be until 2022, particularly on the big stuff, the stadiums and stuff like that. So
I'm wondering also, so you have a London consulting that you've been doing since 2018.
mm-hmm.
Kind of, do you find yourself in a different kind of activity right now? How, with your consulting and the work that you do, especially around fundraising events and so on.
Yeah. I'm sorry, please finish the question.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, has that changed, or do you feel that is taking on a new role?
It does in some ways. So, about 18 months ago, I kind of morphed out of that and started working on what I'm working on now, which is there was a nonprofit that started in Austin, Texas in 2013 called Black Fret, F-R-E-T, like a guitar fret. And that they create an interesting model where they basically view popular music like the way the opera, the symphony would be treated in a city, and create unique experiences for donors. And then that money gets aggregated out in grant form to musicians to do the sort of artist development things that maybe indie labels or things like that did in the past. And so in the time since 2013, they've distributed over $2 million in Austin to the musicians there. And so I prospected bringing that program to Seattle, and we launched that officially. I spent about a year getting that ready and launched that in February this year, just in time for the pandemic, which was great. But through that program, we were still able to give out $50,000 in grants to musicians here in Seattle. And then we're working right now. Our goal is that we are going to expand this to another 5 cities over the next 3 years. So we're working on getting this into a national network. Now, in terms of the consulting work I did, that was more tied to some different projects. One of the things is in Seattle, we lost our basketball team at one point. The Supersonics moved to Oklahoma, and there was 2 consortiums of people that were trying to build new stadiums here to try to lure the team back. But music is a big portion of the business in any of those buildings. And so I was working with one group that was trying to do that, particularly because they were working on a music solution for another piece of property that's tied into this because of some landmark stuff tied to the World's Fair in '62. And I saw this as a great leverage way that if they're going to do all this development here, but they're going to develop an amphitheater and some smaller venues that would support our music community simultaneously, that was a win-win. Unfortunately, our side did not win in that. Another consortium took that over, and we'll see how that all plays out. But yeah, I mean, I just, at this point, am able to be a bridge between the music community and the political community and the business community, and try to use that for good wherever I can.
So I was interested when you mentioned before kind of the venues, multiple venues kind of cooperating and creating more coalitions for trying to make it possible for music and people to continue with their livelihoods. And I'm wondering, do you see this as kind of a change in the relationships of venues, or do you think this is just something that's evolved out of the kind of commonality of what they do?
Well, you mean in terms of the organizing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that there's like many businesses in the U.S. or in the world, you get to a certain point, and then a sort of corporate consolidation happens. And so, what's been happening in the live space in the music business, you have two major players that have been acquiring a lot of independent concert promoters and venues over the last 10 or 15 years, and that's Live Nation and AEG. So what's happening in a lot of cities is that these two folks come and they buy up all the venues, and then they kind of have a stranglehold. And so there are many cities where they have a presence, like they take care of the stuff in the basketball arenas or in the 10,000 seat halls, but the under 1,000 seat clubs are a lot of independent, the 930 Club in DC, or the Troubadour in LA, or the Metro in Chicago. And those are the venues that are the labors of love, and the people that, they don't have the corporate coffers to sit idly, losing $40,000 a month during the pandemic and be able to keep these buildings. And then you simultaneously put what's happening right now with the gentrification I mentioned, where the real estate is getting so valuable. So we have a situation, there's a historic venue here in Seattle called the Showbox. It's like a 1,300 capacity room. I mean, Count Basie played there, all through to, Iggy Pop and Devo, through to all the grunge stuff and blah, blah, blah. But this building was acquired, and they were supposed to build a 40-story building on this because it was one of the last pieces of real estate in Seattle that would have waterfront views. And there's been a lot of organizing. Luckily, the pandemic has stopped this, but where do we dig in, no pun intended, on saving these historical spaces that are cultural hubs and mean something to the community and have a history in and of themselves? And when is it just pure unadulterated capitalism, where it's like all goes to the highest bidder? And I think that we're having a reckoning right now in this industry about how do we preserve these cultural spaces that many people don't think as cultural spaces, right? Many people think of museums or the symphony hall as cultural spaces, but not necessarily these places. But as consumer interests change, as our generation on down, people that didn't necessarily grow up with a great affinity for classical music, and this is their culture now, if we don't preserve them, then there won't necessarily be these places for the next generation, particularly in our our denser urban areas, where the cost to start something like this is astronomical.
Yeah, the relationship to history and the preservation of culture that's represented. I remember in New York, working in a venue that used to be a speakeasy where Billie Holiday used to sing, and just the feeling of that space, to be in that space, right? There's this kind of, for lack of a better term, this residue that's there because of the way these spaces were used. And as gentrification happens and changes things, that residue gets erased, which is really unfortunate. So I'm interested in kind of what your thoughts are around more about preserving history. And you've talked a little bit about it, and the importance of that history in relationship to our culture and our movement into the future.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, you mentioned Billie Holiday and these spaces. I mean, there's a troubling trend that happens in a lot of cities where some promoters don't want to do hip hop related shows because of quote unquote violence or things of that nature, but it's just another form of sort of discrimination. And again, it's trying to create spaces that preserve this cultural legacy, but making sure that they're open to any artist that is cultivated and building a following, that they can work there. Again, it's sort of like we can't have a separate but equal when it comes to music. And there's already a long history of people of color being exploited in the music industry. And I think that this is there's been an ongoing reckoning and an important time to try to find better equality, not only in the live space, but in ownership of rights and recordings and all of that stuff. And so, again, that these spaces, it's about the history, right? I mean, maybe it's just me, maybe it's our generation, but I can go to a brand new building and I can be excited about it. Be like, wow, this is an amazing building. That's the most environmentally sound building that has a zero carbon imprint, whatever. That's great. but I still would rather go to that building that was built in 1920 and go see music in it, and had that sense that those live experiences, that experiential component that everybody has had in it, it kind of drips from the ceiling. And not to mention that, I don't know, I think my ears are just tuned to older spaces in a weird way too, that you go to a state-of-the-art space and there's way too much high end, there's way too much low end, and I guess I'm much more comfortable in the mid-range than in that. So, or maybe it's just my hearing. I don't know. These are not hearing aids, but they could be. Yeah.
Right. So we've got about 8 minutes left. So I wanted to look to the chat to see if there's any questions from our participants. I've got one from April. And so she asks, what do you see as the impact of this socially distant period in time on community?
It's interesting. So I've got 2 kids. My son just started college, my son Maxwell, and my daughter Sylvia is in 10th grade. And, I kind of use them as my little petri dish or focus group, and seeing how that's affecting people in addition to everybody else. I mean, I think as a society, we, knowing how much I keep in touch with many of the people from Antioch, on social media and things of that nature. I mean, there's some good parts about it. There's obviously some bad parts about it, but there's just nothing like being in a room with people, at least to me. I mean, maybe young people feel differently, but, I don't know, maybe I don't know the best way to answer this, but I mean, generationally, like, we didn't have dating apps. We didn't have social media. We didn't have all this stuff. If you wanted to make friends or try to meet somebody to, as a partner or whatever that might be, you had to go out into the world and look for them. And, we couldn't just order a 4-course meal from somebody that'll deliver it to your house in 30 minutes, right? It was a different experience. And I'm not to say that one's better than the other. I'm incredibly jealous of young people's access to content, to music, that in our generation, I'd have to mow a couple lawns to buy one record and listen to it for 2 weeks until I could afford to buy another one. Whereas I talk to young people now and they can absorb whole genres in a couple weeks, getting on YouTube or Spotify or whatever it may be. And that's amazing to me. That's amazing to me. Not to mention from a learning standpoint, that anybody that wants to learn a song, or you can take lessons on all kinds of things. I mean, whether it's fixing my car or learning to play a song, I can find somebody on YouTube to do that for us. And I think it just changes. But from what the social distancing is going to do, you're going to maybe get some amazing solo records from people. Already musically is done so much more electronically now, in the box, as they call it. And people that are doing that are, they don't need other people to do that. They need other people to listen to it. But it's like anything. There's going to be some amazing stuff. There's going to be some substandard stuff. There's going to be some stuff in the middle. And like any piece of music, we can tell you what the background story is, but if either you feel something or you don't when you listen to it. And so whether it's made in the pandemic or whether it's made in the quote unquote best of times, if it doesn't make you feel something, if you reach to change the channel, if it's on, then it's not for you, right?
So we have another question from Denny Eagleson, and she wants to know, how has your own music making evolved from the time you spent at Antioch?
Well, I think like most things, hopefully you get better at it, right? So from a technical standpoint, I think I'm a better musician than I was back then. I think that in art and culture, there's a certain value in the naivete of youth, that you'll maybe do stuff sometimes in that point without that larger perspective that can be very effective. But sometimes in hindsight, you look at that as well and you're sort of like, oh, that I should have worked on that more, or things like that. And so I like to think of songs as kind of photos, like vacation pictures, right? They capture a place and time when you wrote them. And so I think that I have a better sense on song construction now. I have a much more robust of 30 more years of music that I've listened to and ingested. I've recorded a ton of music at this point, so the process of that has been demystified, or I have a better understanding of it. But there's still something great about seeing some people in their late teens or 20s doing something together that just blows your mind. You're like, where did this come from? this sounds like nothing I've ever heard before. And I could spend a million years and I could never come up with that. So I don't know if that totally answers that question, but that's what I'm sticking with.
We have another question from Keith Hickman. Wants to know, how important are stories to the preservation and continuation of these very important spaces? How powerful is the narrative to moving forward?
Well, I think that it's immensely important. I think in the music space in particular, there's sort of like a 4-year life cycle. Generationally, it used to be that, like, most people got stuck in the music they listened to in high school and college, and then they didn't progress after that. In spaces that can happen too, that you'll get, when most people start going to see shows, it's when they're in their late teens, early 20s, and they're going there to see that artist that they love in that moment, maybe not even knowing that, So for example, there's a lake here in Seattle called Green Lake that's in the center of the city, and it used to have an aqua amphitheater, and Led Zeppelin on one of their first tours played on a floating like raft out in this thing for like 1,000 people or something like that. There's no plaque there that tells you that happened. It's only like you find out about it. And I think these cultural spaces are starting to do a better job of documenting their history. For example, the Showbox that I mentioned, at one point they did a project where they put up on the, they had all this glass stuff in one part of it, and they engraved the names of about 1,000 artists that had played there over the years. And you start seeing that all in one place, and then you feel the history of that space when you're in it. You're like, oh, wait a minute, they played here, and they played here, and they played here, and I'm here seeing this. And then there's also sort of like that punch card part where you're like, oh, I was at that show, and I was at that show, and I was at that show, and I was at the show. And so we're building our own personal sort of CVs of our own experience as well that tie to these spaces.
Okay, we've got about a minute and a half left.
Okay.
So I'd like to turn it over to you for any last words that you'd like to give us.
Sure. Well, again, I look back, I'm going to echo what Keith said, and I think everybody said that, it's hard to believe 30 years ago was 30 years ago. But that, Antioch was, it was a transformational experience for me in so many ways. I mean, I kind of say that, I learned as much from my peers as I did from my professors, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think there's people like you, Michael, who are a couple years ahead of me that, we were talking about this the other day, that the great thing about Antioch and people going on co-ops is that, pre-internet, people were bringing music back from different places, from Europe, from other, big cities, like all this stuff, and you'd hear stuff and get turned on to stuff. And I love that sense of discovery that I don't know whether a algorithm will ever be able to reproduce, at least for me. And that, to your point, making these foundational friendships, and then most importantly, finding my life partner, Roseanne Moss London, and how I sometimes joke, like, I don't know how people, can end up in a relationship together that didn't go to college together. I mean, we basically have the same shared foundation. We know everything that each other knows, and that, it's a weird thing. I think people can probably relate that, as I said, my son just started college. I mean, he's basically the age right now that when Roseanne and I met each other for the first time. So seeing that cycle of life, and I guess in closing, I only wish that the world was in a better place, that that we were doing this in person and not over Zoom. But it's still good to see a bunch of names and that I recognize. And then lastly, I hope that Antioch can keep on keeping on, right? And that other people can have their experiences. It doesn't work if we're trying to get them to have our experiences. They have to have their experiences and use it as the platform, as the launch pad for what they're going to do over the next 30 or 40 years of their career. And it's incumbent on us as stewards of the legacy, just like we're talking about those music venues, to support the college and allow the next generation to have those experiences, not only with the professors, but building their own peer groups and creating their kind of squads that are going to go off and change the world in their own ways.
Thank you
really again for having me. It's really an honor. Thank you.
Well said, Ben. There was one more question in the in the chat though, which I thought was interesting question. So Matt Ott says, "I see Alcohol Funny Car put its first single out in over 20 years. Someday, what motivated you to put that out under Alcohol Funny Car rather than under Ben London?"
Okay. Yeah, just real quickly. So, Alcohol Fun Car was a band I was in the '90s. We made records and toured and did all that sort of stuff. And uh, in the pandemic, in the lockdown, I got with just for fun was doing a bunch of songwriting with other people, a collaborative process, just as a way to not go insane. And kind of got going on this idea, and it re-engaged. One of them, my friend Tommy, who was an Alcohol Funny Car, we're still good friends, and just said, "Hey, well, why don't we do a song together? Why not? There's nothing, no risk in doing it." And we did it. And then a really good friend of ours decided to make a video around it that documented all the shuttered venues in the Seattle area and the murals that have been created on all of them as part of it. So it was just a little art project, but again, like if you think of songs as photos, it was just a way of trying to capture this moment. And we'll look back later, or I'll look back later and be like, "Yep, that was 2020."
Wow. Cool. I'll have to check the song out. That's great.
Yeah.